Namaste and good afternoon. On behalf of Sahitya Akademi, I heartily welcome all the scholar participants and all the connoisseurs of Indian short fiction who are watching us live under Sahitya Akademi's Webline literature series. In this particular segment, we will have a symposium in English on Indian short fiction. And the scholar participants who are going to present their views and their papers in this symposium are Joseph Kohipalli Josephji, then Josephji, Mala Pandurangaji, Mandakini Bhattacharyaji, Rajat Chaudharyji, and the symposium will be chaired by Professor Jatendra Kumar Nayakji. At the outset, I request Professor Jatendra Kumar Nayakji to please open the symposium and put forth his views. Then later, we will one by one invite each of the participants to share their views on Indian short fiction. I invite humbly Professor Jatendra Kumar Nayakji to share his views first as chair of this symposium. Nayakji retired as Professor of English from Utkal University in 2016. His English translations of classic Odia novels have been published by Oxford University Press, University of California Press, and Penguin Books. Routledge will publish a volume titled Critical Discourse in Odia, which he co-edited. He is currently member of the English Advisory Board of Sahitya Akademi and has won the Katha Translation Award, besides the Hutch Crossword Indian Fiction Translation Award. Hearty welcome, Professor Jatendra Kumar Nayakji.
Thank you, sir. I deem it a very pleasant duty and a rare privilege to chair this symposium on Indian short fiction. We are fortunate in having 5 distinguished resource persons who will discuss aspects of Indian short fiction and deepen our understanding of this literary form. I so much look forward to learning from the deliberations. I'm sure their presentations will raise questions in the minds of the listeners, which we will address, or which will be addressed after all the presentations are made. It has been said that the short story or short fiction is the most widely distributed form of literature. No human community can be imagined without its vibrant storytelling traditions. In fact, without our knowing it, we are all storytellers, bad, good, or indifferent. Children love to listen to stories from their grandparents. The anecdotes we share with each other are, after all, stories of one kind or another. Stories are so central to our very existence as human beings, and such is the power they exercise over us that sometimes our very survival depends on our ability to tell a story, a good, gripping story. The Arabian Nights furnishes the most famous example of Scheherazade saving her life through the compelling stories she narrated to her husband, the Sultan, who would have otherwise killed her had she not told a gripping or compelling or riveting narrative. While fairy tales, folk tales, and other forms of oral narratives have always been with us, the modern short story has a recent origin. In fact, in the West, it arrived on a literary scene in the 19th century, which was already dominated by the novel, an expansive genre. In the beginning, it was looked upon as a condensed novel from which elements like elaboration and explanation have been taken out. But as time passed, with the material circumstances of publication changing and the emergence of the periodical press, short stories came to receive critical attention, and attempts to define it negatively came to be resisted. Even today, I think that tradition persists because short stories do not enjoy the kind of critical respect or attention that novels or plays or poetry receive. And it's only recently that Alice Munro received the Nobel Prize for writing short stories. Earlier, no short story writer ever received a Nobel Prize. So critical neglect, in a sense, in some form or the other, continues. But the situation had changed subtly. Its very shortness came to be regarded as a source of positivity. Its immense popularity in America and Russia, and the emergence of great writers of short stories like Turgenev, Chekhov, and Poe compelled critics to rethink the genre. Attempts were made to define the short story in terms of its unity of effect and other things with which we are all familiar. Henry James argued that the very brevity of the short story could generate rich complexity. And James Joyce emphasized that short stories produce epiphany, a sudden moment of revelation, and didn't simply serve to arouse curiosity and fulfill or satisfy at the end of one's reading experience. Its very fragmentariness was no longer seen as a limitation or shortcoming, but as a reflection of the fragmented existence of man, human beings living under conditions of technological and industrial economy. The form became popular among the marginal and the colonized as it expressed their feelings of inconsequence. India has one of the richest traditions of storytelling. Katha Sarit Sagar, Panchatantra, Hitopodesa, and the Jataka tales bear eloquent testimony to the richness of this tradition. These travel to various parts of the world and assume new forms and meanings. It's claimed that Aesop's fable has absorbed many tales from the Panchatantra. Our epics can be seen as a universe of interconnected stories which continue to have an inexhaustible appeal and enriched dimensions of the here and the now. But during colonial rule, under the impact of Western education, especially in the 19th century, literary traditions in India underwent significant transformations through exposure to Western literature. Writers in Indian languages began experimenting with many forms, novel, sonnet, elegies, but they also experimented vigorously with the form of the modern short story in creative ways, and the result has been a spectacular one. Fakir Mohan Senapati in Odia, Rabindranath Tagore in Bangla, Premchand in Hindi, Bashir, and countless others wrote memorable and richly layered short stories, which the world will treasure. But none of these outstanding practitioners of the form was a slavish or passive imitator of a Western. In experimenting with a form that had been shaped in the West, they never lost touch with the unique, the sources of, the mainspring of, the unique and powerful native traditions of storytelling. In subtle and powerful ways, one energized and enriched the other. These are but stray thoughts expressed by a layman like. We look forward to listening to the experts present here who will illuminate various dimensions of Indian short fiction and explore the complex negotiations between tradition and modernity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. It was so brilliant an opening. You have, in so very brief time, elaborated upon the traditions of short fiction in India, citing instances right from Katha Sarit Sagar and other literary classics. Thanks a lot. So with the approval of the chair, I will invite our first resource person, Dr. Joseph Kohipalli Joseph, who teaches English and comparative literature at Central University of Kerala. At present, he heads its Department of English and Comparative Literature and was its Dean of School. Dr. Joseph writes both in English and in Malayalam and also translates from and into these two languages. He translated the 2011 Sahitya Akademi awarded Malayalam fiction Adu Jeevitham by Benjamin into English as Goat Days for Penguin in 2020. This translation, which became the basis of further translations of the work into several world languages, was among the top 5 for DSC Prize at Jaipur Literary Festival in 2013. He is also associated with the People's Linguistic Survey of India and edited its Kerala Lakshadweep volume. Apart from translation, his other fields of expertise include Indian diaspora studies and Indian adaptations of Shakespeare. Welcome, Dr. Joseph.
Thank you, Professor. Dear Jatendra Kumar Nayak ji and fellow scholars, I'm here to speak about the Indian the short fiction, basically from Kerala. Now, as Jatendra ji also already said, we have a glorious tradition, the tradition of starting from Brihat Katha or even earlier. But now we are living in the days when these even Panchatantra stories, which were translated from us, are being translated back to us. Our short story tradition, as people say, began with, the modern short story tradition starts with the translation of the English stories. And the same is in the case of Kerala also. It starts perhaps with the 1821 or 24 translation of Benjamin Bailey. It's stories translated for the children. That begins like that. It came in 1921 from CMS Press. But this is not how the short story tradition is seen in Kerala. It usually dates from the written formal tradition of the standard short story format. It begins with a Sahitya Akademi book, Comparative Literature, edited by K.M. George in 1984, claims it begins with Vengayil Kunjiraman Nayar's Vasana Vigrudi in 1891. And that book, in that book, Dr. Achyutan gives a reading of the short stories. It gives a historical reading of the short stories in Malayalam till the year of its publication, that is 1984. And then we have another record of it, study of the same by Dr. A.J. Thomas, who was also the editor of Sahitya Akademi's journal, Indian Literature, that came out in 1990 somewhere. That work also came out. So, but all these claim to say that there's a standardized kind of segmentation of the progress of Malayalam short stories from the early ones to the 90s, where it gets it goes into the typical postmodern kind of a structure. But as A.J. Thomas speaks tells us in his article, we find that the crop of stories that comes with modernism, where in nature and defied any attempt of classification. And he describes them as postmodern and sometimes even anti-modern. Now, we have also another problem, as Jyoti has already pointed out. Short story is supposed to be short. But how short can be a short story, or how long can be a short story? What kind of experience is to be condensed into that short story? How brilliantly it is to be condensed? All these are problems. We have O.V. Vijayan, who has got an 8-line short story, or even less. We have short stories that run into more than 30 pages. So all experiences are unique. And by the line of the story that I translated from Akademi in Adu Jeevitham, one line that beautifully it captures, it appears on the cover page. For us, the lives that we haven't lived are mere fiction. Short fiction conveys a unique experience, public or private, urban or rural, marginalized or mainstream, male or female, adult or child, Deshi or Margi, and there are thousands of shades in between and beyond. Whether didactic or not, whether they convey pathos or not, there are several shades in between and beyond haunt us like a long forgotten song. The nuances in their narratology, uniqueness of theme, complexity of imagery, subtlety of character, experiment in style are for scholars. But for the readers, it is a unique experience which immerses them into the small universe of experience, which itself, when they read, is like an ocean. Readers of short fiction like Ayyappa Panikar, who took on Radhakrishnan's Indian literature is one, though it is written in different languages, with a complementary, Indian literature is one because it is written in different languages, feel that human experience is universal because of the uniqueness of human experiences. Short fiction expresses them best and enrich the Indian universe of experience and contribute to human experience itself. I'm trying to tell you about one short story that appeared in Malayalam in 2019, which also got not the Central Sahitya Akademi Award, but the Kerala Sahitya Akademi Award in 2019. It's a short story called Ramachi. Ramachi by Vinoy Thomas, a school teacher from neighboring district of mine. This is a Malayalam short story which describes the tribal families which do not feel at home in their fertile 1-acre plot into which they are resettled by the government. By examining this place as a distinct category, the story presents the effects of the unmindful human intervention in nature and how it affects the marginalized, how female organic resilience nurture nature. The title Ramachi itself conflates two images: Sita, Ram's wife, or Rama's Achi, as in Malayalam, and a pristine forest nestled deep within the Aralam Wild Sanctuary in Kannur. A tribal girl, Malliga, in the story, retreats along with her husband, like Sita, the earth's daughter, back into the forest, deep into the forest, this time to give birth. Malliga chooses it, unlike Sita, who is abandoned there. Now, her reminiscence and the delivery in the forest constitute the outline of the story that deftly unfolds the spiritual universe of the food-gathering Paniya tribe, for whom forest is a home gifted by Mother Nature and to which everything belongs. Although the text does not use the word nature, which means birth in Latin, it is centered around a rebirth of the tribal matriarch. But that is not how the story begins. It's a beautiful beginning. It begins with a description of a tamer elephant named Pramukhan, who is brought into Aralam tribal settlement to drive away the herd of wild elephants back to the forest. But unfortunately, what happens, to the dismay of the onlookers, what happens is that this tamer elephant is lured away by two young cow elephants back along with them into the forest. Watching this, Malliga, the pregnant wife of the wild Pradeepan, her husband's name is Pradeepan, he is described as a wild person. She recollects how her own life in the forest with the matriarch was a better one. And she recollects what the name of the matriarch. Her name is Manyamutti. Manya means yellow. The Mutti, the grandmother, had told her parents were in the forest. Forest was their home. I was born in Ramachi. My mother used to say that a yellow flower fell on my chest when I was born, and I was named Yellow. Nature yielded just enough to survive for the people in the forest, but they had no worries about tomorrow, so they did not hoard. They lived with nature. Manyamuti, we can see the people of the tribe abusing the civilized people for being selfish, who fish during the breeding season. And Mallika's husband takes just enough honey for them to survive. And he even replaces an orchid, which he plucked from a tall tree for a scholar to photograph. If in this wandering tribe, women decided, when they started to settle in the Aralam tribal settlement, men began to decide, because men own land. In the forest, Mallika could easily turn down the proposal of the family of a person, even after having sex with him. Her family had no disrespect for her decision. However, when they come to the colony, the same man spares her only because she is pregnant. The central movement in the story is Mallika's decision to go to Ramachi, the lap of the forest mother, to become a mother. She decides, and Pradeepan goes with her to the forest, like the tamed wild elephant Pramukhan. But he is helpless at her most critical moment. Sitting on the top of the tall tree collecting honey, he sees Mallika giving birth and rushes down. From the tall tree, he sees the old tamer, but now turned wild elephant Pramukhan, hiding behind the woods and preparing to charge at Mallika and her baby. As he becomes frozen with fear, the herd of cow elephants suckling their babies cross their path and take Pramukhan away. Meanwhile, a yellow flower falls on the baby, and she decides to name her after the matriarch, Manyamuti. Deciding to go to Ramachi, Mallika was inspired by the same Manyamuti, who signifies tribal tradition. When she was told that she is given 1 acre plot, Manyamuti poignantly asked them, "Didn't we have land till now?" She fails to comprehend how the tribe who owned the entire forest is now landless. Unable to reconcile with this civilization, the tribal matriarch dies in the forest on the very same day before moving to the colony. Ramachi becomes a narrative of love and care and feminist discourse that conveys motherly tenderness and care, nurturing her baby deep within the security and comfort of her womb. The Kohipalli, a particular bird that flies with its food for its partner in the nest, the wild squirrel who munches on the irimullan nuts as pairs, the Pramukhan who grabs tenderly and kisses the wild elephant, the cow elephant. We know it turns Ramachi into a place of idyllic space and love, and where loving and sharing alone makes sense. The story Ramachi signifies the need to address ecological issues engendered by patriarchal structures and through feminine resilience. The author deftly fuses human and animal worlds in the forest into an organic post-human whole at the place Ramachi, which exposes nature-culture divide that modernity underlines. This delicate post-human discourse of a tribal girl's eco-critical feminist discourse abounds with epiphanies of the ordinary, as one critic has put it, and exposes the fissures between tribal and modern worlds. Manyamuti's death, return to the womb of the earth, and her rebirth through the womb of Mallika is a discourse of seamless continuity of being and exposes the hollowness of the patriarchal claims and partition and ownership of the earth, and encapsulates modern discourse with a nature driven by empathy and love. The elephants tame the wild Pramukhan and Mallika tames the wild Pradeepan with primordial empathy which overflows boundaries. It is the same that makes the suckling elephants block Pramukhan from charging at the hapless mother and the child in their most vulnerable moment. It is this empathy that helps the tribe move freely, like the fish in the water or the birds and bees in the sky, or animals in the forest, and like the wind and the light and the darkness, which connect them all to be. Ramaji becomes a post-Anthropocene space where humans and animals must coexist in nature. Mallika gives the baby the freedom of the deep forest from which her ancestors were evicted, and reiterates that the decision of naming the child after Manyamuthi, who refuses to be modernized. More than a romantic story of a journey of a pregnant tribal girl and lover into the forest, or a story of the empathy of the forest, the empathy that the forest showers on the couple and on their newborn babe, it is a discourse on the primordial forces which equate forest with mother. Ramachi can now be seen as a take on the modernist discourse which reserve forest and confine the tribes to their 1 acre civilized plots in order to protect animals and civilized tribals. The state's welfare measures, which masquerade corporate capitalist demands of forest for agricultural plantations and developmental projects, connect Adivasi philosophy, which refuse to see earth as private property. So this is the universe in which our story unfolds. Now, when A.J. Thomas said that these defy categories, these such stories defy categories of categorization. What we find is that modern short story writers of Kerala, there are many. From the textbook we will find so many other kind of writers which are prescribed in the university curriculum and the syllabus curriculum elsewhere. But there are brilliant short story writers of the current generation in Kerala who use short story as a very powerful method. And some of these short stories are now made into films. This is a typical in Kerala. So many of these short stories. And there are recent award-winning films, most of them are made from the short stories. V.R. Sudhish, Sri Raman, and other writers are also there. But now the question is, how long is a short story or how short it is? Thank you very much.
Dr. Joseph, that was wonderful. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Now I invite our second scholar, resource person, Shri Joshi Josephji, who is a bilingual writer and has done several translations and critical studies in both English and Malayalam. He has presented several papers and delivered numerous lectures at various regional and national seminars. Josephji is a teacher of literature with more than 27 years of experience. Welcome, Dr. Sri Joshi Josephji.
Thank you. I find it indeed a great honor and privilege to take part in this online symposium on Indian short fiction. I thank the organizers and also greet my fellow participants. I'll start off from where my friend Professor Joseph Kohipalli ended. He was talking about this brilliant crop of new generation writers in Malayalam, many of whose stories are now made into movies. I've taken up one such writer, S. Harish, and a brilliant story by S. Harish, which was made into a movie by Lijojo Spellisheri. The story is titled Maoist, and the movie is titled Jellikattu, which was India's official entry to the Oscars in 2020, one of the finest movies to come out of Kerala in recent times. There's one Lijojo Spellisheri, the award for the best director at the National Film Festival as well. My paper is not about the movie. My paper is about this short story. It is titled Crowd, Power and Pathology, a critical reading of S. Harish's short story, Maoist. I'll just say a word about S. Harish. He's a brilliant contemporary writer who is not very prolific. He has not written much but is a writer of the highest quality. Has written one novel, which is Misha, and which has been translated into English as Mustache, and this won the JCB award in 2020, last year, which, as you all know, is the highest one of the highest literary awards in the country. Harish writes basically short stories. He also writes screenplays. Now, this story, Maoist, was published in a periodical, I think, in 2018, and it's a brilliant narrative. And my paper is an attempt to read this short story based on the theoretical and psychological insights provided by the great Elias Canetti, German writer and novelist, who's perhaps best known for his novel Auto de Fe, but whose best work is perhaps this wonderful study, Crowds and Power, which is in which he probes the dynamics of the crowd and the relationship between crowds and power, and it gives the pathology of social paranoia and mob psychosis, the majoritarian impulse that we see all around the world, and all those things. This is considered as the definitive analysis of such behavior, and I found it very useful for this reading of this short story by S. Harish. Okay, I've prepared a paper here, and because of shortage of time, I'll just run through this paper. Okay. Maoist is a brilliant satire that exposes and ridicules the base instincts and collective behavior of a group of people, mostly men. The argument of the story is that our civilizational or cultural pretensions are hollow, and that we are basically the same primitive, atavistic Neanderthals we once were. The story takes place in a remote, high-range agrarian village in Kerala, where most of the inhabitants or their ancestors had migrated decades ago, some perhaps years ago, some many decades ago, looking for cultivable land. Two buffaloes, meant for Sunday butchering, escape from captivity and run amok through the length and breadth of the terrain, destroying crops, damaging property, and terrifying the public in the process. Now, the men in the village, the bold guys, they gang up to catch the animals, and a veritable hunt is set off. The plot thickens while the hunt turns into a dangerous game of hide and seek. Many curious characters are introduced, and the private story is integrated. Everything centers on the chase, and the story races to its violent climax. The human-animal binary is subverted. Now, the title Maoist is used rather ironically, with layers of subtle connotations. There are at least 4 Maoist connections in the story. The first one is perhaps the opening statement. The narrative begins with a statement that it is rumored, or there is this rumor, that a poster has appeared on the walls of the village library, with a statement written in blood. So that is how the play opens. It's just a rumor. So, and there is also a group of armed special police camping in the village for a while, because again, it is rumored that someone had spotted some people suspected to be carrying arms. So that's the first connection. The second connection, you have a character, Prabhakaran, a minor character, who is a wasteful, useless guy who once tried to blackmail a local planter into paying him money. What he did was he wrote an extortionary letter to this guy, pretending to be a Naxalite and asking for money, but he got eventually arrested. So then, and the third reference, of course, is to the 2 buffaloes, and the 2 buffaloes, well, one male and the other female. And if my friend Kohipalli's story talked about elephants, my story talks about buffaloes. Okay, now the bull, which was originally reared in Telangana, is named Bhanu after its owner's son. And this son is a bookish youth, and he goes to Delhi, and he, gets into what his parents and his neighbors would say is the wrong company, and the police are now looking for him. But the intellectual bookish guy who got carried away by some revolutionary zeal or whatever. Again, there's no mention of the word Maoist as such, but it's just subtly hinted. And then the fourth is after the climactic encounter, there's a reference to a group of men hiding in the forest. Of the two buffaloes, the cow actually escapes into the forest, and this occurs at the very end of the story. And there, the four or five young men, they come across this cow, the cow buffalo, and they are these supposed Maoists, but Harish's narrative describes them as being in fear of the police. These guys are hungry, miserable, and disillusioned. Unlike, the terrifying, or completely different from the terrifying image that the people have about Maoists. Okay. Now, the whole story can also be read as a political allegory of the way the state, the media, the public, the various institutions and organizations together constitute a crowd that gangs up against a common enemy, often imaginary. I'm not defending Maoism. Actually, I think it is a stupid thing to do in these days. But even if we agree with its cause, one cannot agree with their method. But what I'm trying to highlight is the way the state, the media, and everything gang up as if in a hunt against this common enemy. That is what the story is also about. Now, I want to bring in Kennedy here. I told you this paper is a reading of the story using Kennedy's insights. Okay. And I'm quoting Kennedy here. Elias Kennedy says, "The crowd is the same everywhere, in all periods and cultures. It remains essentially the same among men of the most diverse origin, education, and language. Once in being, it spreads with the utmost violence. Few can resist its contagion." Elias Kennedy, Crowds and Power. Now, in India, Maoism is projected by the state and the media, as well as imagined and internalized by the public as a bogey of all danger, a threat to peace, a hurdle in the path of progress. In short, the enemy of the nation. The Maoist in the public imagination is capable of utmost destruction and therefore must be eliminated at the earliest and by all means. Governments find it convenient to create this bogey. It gives them unlimited power, unaccountable resources, and absolute control of the public discourse. The attractions of the Maoist hunt are numerous that if there is none, the state wouldn't mind inventing one. I want to bring in Kennedy again. I quote, "It is always the enemy who started it. Even if he was not the first to speak out, he was certainly planning it. And if he was not actually planning it, he was thinking of it. And if he was not thinking of it, he would have thought of it." Unquote. Harish's story is laced with brilliant irony, keen observation, and consistent social satire and sarcasm. The narrative spares no one. An array of characters representing various social classes and sections are presented. Nobody is idealized. People are selfish and motivated. They're simply selfish. It's a fierce world of the struggle for survival. There's no room for compassion or consideration for the other. And I'll just run through some of the major characters here. One is Kalan Varki. He gets his name from the family trait of long legs. He's an uncouth butcher, foul-smelling and foul-mouthed, but somehow manages to seduce several women. He keeps their husbands happy by being generous with the meat cuts and the free lumps of fat he gives on Sundays. Now, the quality of meat Varki gives depends on the customers. The best quality is reserved for the parish priest and also the elites of the village. Whereas even the Reverend Sisters of the convent are eligible only for mediocre stuff. Talk about the gender politics of food. And it's again the same quality that is given to the local toddy shop. Now, there are some pious Hindu families who relish the dishes but do not want to be seen buying the meat publicly. Well, they are secretly serviced by Kalan Varki. He delivers a packet at their back door. Now, Varki is a master and lord in his territory. He bosses over Antony, the orphan boy who helps him with all the hard work of butchering and cleaning and all that. Now, Antony is treated like a slave. But at the end of the story, we see a nice role reversal. I'll come to that later. Now, Kuriachan, another character, is a local landlord and planter, and he had a humble beginning like everyone else. but he was lucky enough to turn to cash crops earlier than anyone else. He made a lot of money by growing rubber trees and cardamom plants. Then Handa Kuttachan is another interesting character. Unlike Kuriachan, this guy lives in the outside or outskirts of mainstream society. He is a criminal engaging in illegal activities such as poaching forest animals, brewing illicit liquor, and trading in drugs. He was caught and imprisoned for a while, but later he joins Varki as an assistant. He once tried to trap Varki in a criminal case and take over the control of the shop, but he was thrashed and chased out of the village by the people. He gets his moment of revenge when the same villagers seek his help because he has a gun. And it is actually they're seeking the help of his gun to catch the buffaloes. He too joins the hunt and becomes Antony's enemy for one more reason, yet another reason. Antony had already replaced him at Varki's shop, and both men are eyeing the good-looking Sophie, the only child of Varki. There are other curious characters as well. There is Keshu the rogue. There is Paul, the former politician, but now a full-time farmer. There's a retired colonel. Then there is Sudhir, the young boy who has just finished his studies at Bengaluru and now spends all the time on the social media. Then there is Ammani, the prostitute who also sells chicken. Then there is a Tamilian moneylender who appears only on Saturdays and to collect the interest and weekly interest. And then Ramu, the former footballer who had snitched Kuttachan to the police. These are some of them. Now, the story also has an allegorical undercurrent about our political practice. You see a frenzied mob mindlessly chasing a target with no principles or scruples, but only to satisfy the selfish interests. And that this forms the crux of the narrative. The buffaloes on the run give many a man an opportunity or an excuse to have his way, to settle scores, or even take advantage of the situation. I want to bring in Canetti here again. I quote, "Seizing and incorporating, there is nothing about us which is more strongly primitive," unquote. Youngsters use this as an excuse to venture out at night and celebrate their newfound freedom with a bottle of liquor. Lovers find it convenient to meet up now that the men, read fathers and husbands, are away from home. They're all busy with the hunt. Harish sustains a satirical tone throughout, even as the narrative probes the psychological motives of the characters and their actions, especially the mob behavior that is repeatedly highlighted. For instance, when the bull charges down the street into the crowd, someone pushes a moneylender in front of the angry beast. Similarly, when the bull comes near the office building that houses the local cooperative society, the doors are conveniently opened and the bull is let into the building. It runs amok through the office furniture and equipment, and while someone conveniently sets the files on fire, presumably to smoke the animal out of the building, but actually to destroy the documents of the loans they have availed. Kuriachan, the planter, has scheduled his daughter's engagement for Sunday, and Varki had promised to give high-quality buffalo meat, but now it looks impossible. On the eve of the function, Kuriachan panics and gets out to find an alternative. It's midnight, and he goes to Ammani's house in the neighborhood to buy some chicken from her. He has to serve some kind of meat, if not buffalo meat, at least chicken will do. And Ammani, a woman of disrepute, opens the door at midnight and welcomes him in affectionately. Unfortunately for both of them, the crowd that had followed Kuttachan spot this and, mistaking this to be an adulterous adventure, arrest the man. They shower expletives on Ammani and they undress Kuriachan and parade him down the street, as like a trophy. And the crowd celebrates this catch with drum beats, feeling greater happiness than in hunting the animals down. There is also a funny spoof on the hollow rhetoric and rituals of political parties, especially the kind of sloganeering that communist parties in Kerala are famous for. When the rampaging buffalo destroys, among other things, a party monument, wooden stakes wrapped in red cloth and installed in memory of the murdered comrades, the party calls them martyrs, the comrades who got killed. When the bull destroys the local members gather in protest. One of them instantly begins to shout rhythmic slogans against Varki. And Harish has beautifully captured it. That slogans against Varki, the owner of the buffaloes. When the leader points out that Varki is a party benefactor, and also Varki gives him and the leaders good quality meat every week, the comrades immediately change the slogans and target the buffalo instead. So in the next round of slogans are against the buffalo or the bull. At nightfall, people get anxious that the two animals are still at large. The beast, in the meantime, has grown in stature in the collective imagining of the public. In fact, the buffalo gets personified, the bull gets personified. People began to address it as he, as if the bull is, I quote my own translation of Harish's sentence, a formidable man, at once clever, vengeful, and lusty. Unquote. When the man is to drive one of them, and it turns out to be the cow, into an unused well, the men turn sadistic and inflict all kinds of torture on the helpless beast. And Harish gives graphic description of the kind of violence that human beings are capable of. However, the cow manages to escape again, injuring several people in the commotion. The search continues into the night, and men in small groups move in different directions. When Kuttachan gets Raman alone, Raman who had snitched him earlier to the police, when Kuttachan gets Raman alone near the rocky terrain surrounded by bamboo shoots, he seizes the opportunity for revenge and stabs him with wooden horns, which he had actually brought deliberately for this purpose, wooden horns. And he stabs the wooden horns on either side of Raman's belly. And he would declare later to the public that Raman was actually attacked by the bull. By the time we approach the intense climax of the narrative, the people in the village have turned truly hysterical. Taking all kinds of weapons and making all kinds of noise, the men come out in one last desperate attempt to find the beast. They succeed before the break of dawn, but it is just the beginning of a violent end. The wounded and exhausted cow plunges into the nearby forest and disappears. It's now time for the climactic encounter between the men and the bull. So it's going to be a men's game now from here on. So the men on one side and the rampaging bull on the other, both equally violent and relentless. Kuttachan leads the offensive. He, in fact, even appears victorious for a while, holding the bull by the horns like a Jellicut hero. That I think that's just one reference to the word Jellicut, where Kuttachan is described as looking like a Jellicut hero. I think that's what gave Lijojo Pellicheri the title of his movie. But only to be thrown off. The bull throws off Kuttachan, and by the angry beast. In fact, Kuttachan is fatally wounded. And the next description you see is Kuttachan being carried down the hill on a bamboo pole. And don't miss the irony here, like a hunted beast, the people carry Kuttachan on a bamboo pole to hospital. When Kuttachan falls, the fight is given up. The bull is allowed to escape to the forest. On the way, it has to cross a wetland and it gets stuck in the swamp. Antony recognizes the opportunity, seizes it, and he pounces on the animal. Now, what follows resembles the gladiatorial duel in an ancient amphitheater with a crowd cheering from above. Antony stands naked, like his prehistoric ancestor. Why? Because he uses his loincloth. He has removed his loincloth and he is wearing no underwear. And so he uses it to wrap around the bull's face. So he stands naked. Someone throws a long knife and he stabs the animal deep in the chest. Antony becomes a village hero instantly and is carried on the shoulders by the crowd again in another kind of triumphant march. The bull's body is dragged out of the swamp and in no time is torn apart. People return home with large chunks of meat. The battle is over and the winners share the spoils. I want to bring in Kennedy again. A murder shared with many others, which is not only safe and permitted, but indeed recommended, is irresistible to the great majority of men, unquote. Antony gains not only respect and recognition, but power as well. He becomes a master of the meat shop, and he even gets to sleep with Varki's daughter without having to marry her. On the other hand, Varki, now weakened and humbled, has to assist Antony in the meat shop by chopping the pieces. The story comes full circle, but with the absolute reversal of roles. And finally, this conclusion here. Harish's narrative, Maoist, is my friend Kohipalli was talking about the length of short story these days. This story runs to 33 pages. So you can even call it a novella. It's a long narrative. Maoist inhabits a male territory dictated by elemental vices: greed, gluttony, lust, vanity, cunning, deceit, mischief, pride, power, spite, vengeance, violence, and murder. These impulses are played out within the context of an archetypal human-animal conflict, as well as the expression of mob mentality, mob psychosis. Harish pulls off a brilliant piece of narrative, at once psychological, satirical, and political. What Susan Sontag famously said about Kennedy's book applies to this story as well. It dissolves, I quote, it dissolves politics into pathology, treating society as a mental activity, a barbaric one, of course, that must be decoded. And my humble attempt was to decode Harish's story along these lines. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sri Josephji. Now, I invite Professor Dr. Mala Pandurangaji, who is a principal at Dr. BMN College of Home Science, Mumbai. She is a postdoctoral fellow of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, Germany, and has been nominated as Ambassador Scientist to India for 2019 to 2022. She has also availed of short research grant visits to the University of Osnabrück, Augsburg, Frankfurt, Potsdam, and Chemnitz. Her areas of research include post-colonial writing, diaspora theory, and gender studies. She is a member of the editorial board of the Journal of South Asian Diaspora and is series editor of the Post-Colonial Lives. In 2012, she received the SNDT Women's University Maharshi Karve Utkrishta Shikshak Puraskar, that is Best Teacher Award, from the government of Maharashtra. Under her tenure, Dr. BMN College has been selected as a UGC Stride Center for Research Capacity Building 2020 to 2023. Welcome, Professor Dr. Mala Pandurangaji. I request you now to please present your paper.
Thank you very much to Sahitya Akademi for the opportunity to be part of this very exciting symposium. It has been a very engaging experience learning to the two brilliant papers before me. And my own presentation this afternoon, I will be examining select short Indian fiction in English through the lens of literary gerontology. The dictionary meaning of gerontology is a scientific study of old age, the process of aging, and the particular problems of old people. And these problems are inevitably associated with biological, psychological, social, and cultural experiences. Over the past 2 decades, the science of gerontology has emerged as a crucial multidisciplinary approach in the context of the rapid growth of an aging population, both globally as well as in India specifically. While applying this critical framework, what I will try to do is to demonstrate how select short Indian creative fiction can be read as an important gerontological resource in order to understand both biological and mental aging, and how literary can give us a very valuable entry point into subjective aspects of aging. Such emotional and subjective aspects of aging may not get sufficiently articulated in those studies of aging that are based on pure scientific research methods, which are presented more in terms of numerical data and cold statistics. What literary gerontology does is it allows us to have a closer examination of themes such as bodily function, sexual desire, gender construction, perceptions of mortality in relationship to processes of aging. Importantly, within a classroom, my perspective almost always is that of a teacher of literature who engages with students, and therefore within a classroom, such a framework will allow teachers to use the literary narrative for exercises on interrogating and deconstructing prevalent derived negative stereotypes and attitudes towards aging and ageism. As you know, we have a very large growing population of youth, but we also have a large population of aging and aged people or seniors. And so short fiction can thereby serve as a tool of intervention in any sensitization project towards intergenerational interaction among our youth and student population. There are several short Indian fiction narratives that feature elderly protagonists. We have, for example, Gujarati writer Dhumaketu's Miriam's Letter, which is a story of old Shikari Ali who waits at a post office for 5 years for a letter from his only daughter Miriam that never comes. There is Sujata Balasubramaniam's Zamindar of Palipuram, translated from Tamil. The story of a senile ex-Zamindar who moves back and forth in memory, recalling his days of glory and his present dire circumstances. Of course, there's a well-known story by Shukushwan Singh, Portrait of a Lady, which is an evocative description by the author of how his relationship with his grandmother changes as he grows up. And she turns to sparrows to compensate the loss of personal contact with family members, and especially with her grandson, with whom in his childhood days she was very close. The description of her funeral is quite graphic, of how you have these hundreds of birds who come and wait patiently until her body is finally removed from the room and taken for cremation. These are narratives that present us with aged protagonists whose personalities and experience in the present are defined by the remembrance of the past and losses encountered in their journey into aging. In terms of technique, the narrative strategies oscillate between the past and the present. And in doing so, the authors chart out a path of social exclusion and marginalization. However, when we are applying a literary gerontology framework, I think that we must distinguish between narratives that merely describe characters in terms of their age and associated life stages, and those stories that actually draw us into the mind and world of senior protagonists from the perspective of the aged themselves. Because it is such stories that will offer us an important entry point, how our notions of age can be interpreted and reconferred against existing stereotype and bias. I would therefore indeed be extremely interested in learning from my friends on the panel today at a later stage perhaps, of such stories that are available in Indian languages as also, because that would offer an additional fascinating insight into how aging is perceived in different contexts and by different writers of different linguistic backgrounds. But this afternoon, I would like to illustrate how this particular critical approach can be applied by drawing from two pieces of fiction, short fiction. First, The Remains of the Feast by Geeta Hariharan, published in 1993, and A Devoted Son by Anita Desai, published in 1998. Both these authors take us into the world of their aging protagonists from the perspective of the aged, while also presenting a parallel perspective of aging from the point of view of a younger member of the family. In doing so, the stories allow for a finer understanding of what it means to grow older in the social and cultural context of the Indian joint family, which is very often projected in the popular imagination as performing a noble duty of caring for elder members of the family. And this is a notion that tends to be celebrated in terms of positive aspect of a traditional value system as compared to the more modern functioning of the nuclear family. Therefore, there is always this kind of comparison that in the joint family, the elders are cared for better, and there is much more attention that is given to the elderly. There's a much more secure system than in what we today call as a nuclear family. But a literary gerontological framework will allow for a critical notion, critical reading of the notions of the cared and the caregiver within such contexts. The cared would be the seniors, the aged and the elderly, and the caregiver would be the other family members. Geeta Hariharan's Remains of the Feast is a first-person account of 20-year-old Ratna's vivid memories of the last days in the life of her 90-year-old great-grandmother Rukmani, who is in the terminal stages of cancer. The Ratna, who is 20, and the great-grandmother, who is 90. Ratna's descriptions of her great-grandmother are not typical of those of the elderly, who are often projected as being helpless, ailing, weak, and senile. Rather, she describes her great-grandmother's body, and I quote, as a solid, reliable thing. It's a wonderful, resilient machine. But she also describes the inevitable degeneration of her grandmother's physical body due to the ravages of cancer. Simultaneously, she conveys Rukmani's sense of humor and zest for life even in her 90s. Rukmani begins to stubbornly insist on being fed dishes that she had been denied her entire life as a young Hindu Brahmin widow with a 14-year-old son. And therefore, there is a conspiracy between the 20-year-old Ratna and the 90-year-old Rukmani. Ratna smuggles in cakes, ice cream, biscuits, and samosas made by non-Brahmin hands, and I quote, to the deathbed of a Brahmin widow who had never eaten anything but pure home-cooked food for almost a century, unquote. The old woman becomes increasingly adventurous. She demands fizzy Coca-Cola because she suspects it has alcohol. She demands to have garlic, fruit cake laced with brandy, and bel puri from the fly-invested bazaar nearby. Rukmani is thus projected as asserting agency after having lived a life of continuous denial and suppression of her innate desires as a Brahmin widow. She insists that she must be draped in a sari, a red sari with a big wide border of gold on her death. What Geeta Hariharan does in this short story centers the voice of a marginalized 90-year-old widow who attempts to break away from a lifetime of gendered restrictions. And what emerges is a nuanced perception of age. While Ratna's parents take up their role as caregivers as obligatory and duty-bound, they also consider Rukmani to be a burden to themselves and others. In their eyes, aging is equated to physical and mental decline. After her death, they disregard her wish for a red and golden sari as rumblings of a sick woman who didn't know what she was saying. and instead they wrap her body in a pale brown sari, her widow's weeds. Ratna, on the other hand, defies her grandmother beyond her illness. Her willingness to fulfill all of her wishes, from junk food to beverages to hair removal cream, on her insistence to not be, and I quote, an ugly old woman, demonstrates her acceptance that old age need not necessarily be viewed as a complete decline of the body and spirit, but rather as an opportunity to finally reclaim agency of the self. In the second story that I would like to discuss, Anita Desai, in A Devoted Son, takes up the relationship between a father, Varmaji, and his dutiful son, Rakesh. Rakesh is a well-known doctor. As in Harihan's story, the denial of desired foodstuffs is central to the plight of the elderly protagonist, Varmaji. And his diet is under the surveillance of the ever-watchful eyes of his dutiful doctor's son, who is determined to keep his father healthy by controlling his diet and denying him what he actually craves for. He enforces a strict schedule which includes pills and tonics. Varmaji is considered as incapable of making any decision or choice, and the family feels he must be catered to as a child would. And like Rukmani, we are shown how he gradually becomes trapped in a definitive role associated with old age. Rakesh is lauded for being a dutiful son by the other family members and by his community because he fulfills social expectations of caring for his elderly father and thereby repaying his debt for the education given to him. Varmaji, once a proud father, is reduced to a patient and is constantly spoken to only in the context of his health and physical decline. He interprets his son's actions as cold-heartedness and tyranny in disguise. He complains about his wishes being ignored, taunted by his daughter-in-law, laughed at by his grandchildren. While Hariharan's stories of Rukmani asserting decisions regarding her body and health in the last stages of her life, Varmaji is unable to exert any agency despite his repeated desire to do so. He lies to a cot, and the only time that his point of view is heard is in his conversations with his elderly neighbor Bhatia, who is shown as the only other person in a position to empathize with his plight. I'll come to my conclusion. The two short narratives by Hariharan and Desai challenge the perception that emotions, innate desires, and decision-making powers of the elderly necessarily diminish and are weakened by age and time. Rukmani and Varmaji's yearnings are suppressed by caregivers under the assumption that it is for their physiological good. The onus on their well-being is undertaken by comparatively younger family members as caregivers who are unable to acknowledge, and I quote Wallace, even in frail old age, there is a possibility of an opening up of life. These two fictional accounts, which I have selected once again, become two good texts for any discussion on conflicting notions of interdependence and intergenerational reciprocity within the cultural and social discourses of the middle-class Indian home. Sociologist Hare maintains that, and I quote, responsibility formulates care's strong imperative not to turn away from someone in need. The problem, as I see it, lies in the social definition of need according to age. The sense of responsibility of Rakesh and Rachna's parents towards Rukmani and Verma is based on an assumed accountability reinforced by the perception that they are duty bound to look out for the health and best interests of the cared. These stories draw our attention to moral dilemmas or notions of caregiving, the conflict between the carer and the person being cared for. It draws out equal empathy for the carer who is overtaxed emotionally and physically by the very process of caring, and ultimately resulting in a situation where the carer views the person they are taking care of in terms of a burden. While one is sympathetic with the plight of the aging Rukmani and Varma, as a reader, we are made empathetic to Ratna's parents and Rakesh's position of what may be considered to be as whimsical or peevish behavior on the part of the aged members of their family. Their demands for food of their own choice is interpreted by them as being excessive rather than reasonable. The reader, in the context of these two stories, is not placed in a position to make value judgments. Rather, we are invited to reevaluate the notions of care as associated with duty. And we are reminded to make room for those whose voices have the most, who can add the most to contribute to our understanding of them. And therefore, in conclusion, it is in this context that I posit that stories such as Hariharan's and Desai's become an important addition to a yet to be explored body of Indian resources that can be categorized under the emerging genre of literary gerontology. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for your brilliant paper. May I now invite Ms. Mandakini Bhattacharya ji. She is from Kolkata and an associate professor in English, a multilingual poet, literary critic, and translator as well. Her articles have been published in international and national journals and also anthologized. She has her own poetry page. Her poems have been published by international and national anthologies and journals such as Hibiscus, the Kali Project, Better Than Starbucks, the Hypertexts, Poetry Nation, the Bombay Review, Setu Magazine, the Dautism Journal, Hayati, and Sahityanama. She is editor of the Mixed Fare, a short story anthology, and associate editor of the Muse of Now Paradigm anthology. She was awarded the Philosophic Poetica International Achievement Award, Master of the World, in recognition of her poetry by Philosophic Poetica and Grand Productions Canada at the World Poetry Conference held in Punjab in 2019. Her poems have appeared along with the legends of Indo-English and international, such as K. N. Daruwala, K. Sachidanandan, Vibhu Padhi, Basha B. Fraser, Sanyukta Dasgupta, and many others. She is Joint Secretary of Proyas, a women's NGO in Kolkata. Mandakini ji, I invite you to present your paper.
Thank you so much, Shri Jyotishan Varma. Namaskar. It is so nice to see you in person, sir. And a very good afternoon to all my fellow panelists. I hope I'm audible and I have been floored by your presentations. And it has been lovely listening to this wonderful feast of Indian short fiction. While we usually hear of a few authors in relation to Indian short fiction and who are majorly discussed, it has been rather an exception today when we have been hearing about works of several authors who are not so very well known in Indian short fiction, and continuing this trend, and of course continuing the trend of my previous speaker, I shall try to discuss an area of short fiction which involves many marginal voices which are not so very well known, and I intend to talk today about Dalit women's short fiction. which is also my area of research interest. And these Dalit women, in fact, when you hear about them, mostly when you read their fiction, you will see that their aesthetics is still in development. There has been a lot of nexus established between the African feminism, Afro-American feminism, African-American aesthetics of literature, feminist literature. And the aesthetics of Dalit women's writing is still developing. And we often find that, especially in short fiction, Dalit women are talking to themselves and discovering a narrative. They're discovering their voices about their experiences, and they're trying to narrativize their inner emotions and experiences much more than delivering a strident message to society, unlike Dalit men's literature and mostly in short fiction that we find. So even in the autobiographies, we find that there is a questioning sense of their own identities that they are trying to discover first. So we are all aware of the background of the Dalit movement. We know how the political movement emerged from inspiration in the 1970s from the Black Panthers movement, and they've identified majorly with the African American aesthetics and African American politics. And we have the emergence of the Dalit Panther movement. And then from 1958 onwards, when the first Dalit Literature Conference was also held, we have this emergence of Dalit literature. But where does the Dalit woman figure in all these deliberations of power and upheaval, and what kind of role is she allowed to play in Dalit literature? So while they become victims of Dalit violence outside the home, the Dalit women are objects of lust and always available for upper caste men. They're victims of malnutrition, poor health, forced family planning, reduced life expectancy. So though the women's movement tends to play down the caste factor and insists that all women are subject to violence, in fact, the upper caste feminists who are majorly in charge of the women's movement say that there is only one caste, and that is the caste of women. Dalit women writers have been trying to break away from that mold. And Ruth Manorama has famously said that Dalit women stand at the crossroads of caste, class, and patriarchy, and are subject to a typical form of sexual and physical violence, which needs to be reviewed differently. Gender and patriarchy are situated within this caste-based society in such a way that even Dalit men become complicit to it. Thus, when a naked Dalit woman is paraded naked in front of Dalit men, they avert their eyes. Dalit women are active workers in Dalit movements. They are hailed as rebels and mothers of revolutionaries by Dalit men, yet members of the rural women's liberation movement, for example, a Dalit organization from Arakonam in Tamil Nadu, they recall how members of the Ambedkar mantrams from the area would support cases of atrocity against Dalits, but if a Dalit woman was tortured or killed by her husband, they would not lift a finger. So these things are several issues that are awaiting to be seen reflected in Dalit women's short fiction. We have their poetry, which is extremely potent force, but what about the short fiction that we are reading today of Dalit women? So the early 1990s was the assertion of autonomous Dalit women's organizations at all levels. And as Sharmila Rege has pointed out, this underlined the Brahmanism of the feminist movement and the patriarchal practices of Dalit politics. Issues of caste became the sole responsibility, however, of the Dalit women's organizations. So just like Black feminists, Dalit women have also protested against the bias that they face within their society as well as outside their society. And they have protested against this assertion of only a single caste in the feminist movement, that is the caste of women. So in order to level this caste, in order to bring all women onto the platform of the same feminist movement, upper caste feminists have so many times said that, have celebrated the concept of motherhood as a leveling factor. But Dalit women like Urmila Pawar and Bama have appropriated this concept of motherhood and have tried to turn the tables through their short fiction, and they've used their own metaphors. For example, if you read Urmila Pawar's story Kavach or Armor, the protagonist is Indira, and she's a seller, mango seller who sells mangoes in the market, and her son Gaurya is awed by his teacher, his female teacher, who replies back to the male members of the teaching staff whenever she is insulted for her caste. And he is extremely disturbed by the way her mother's customers try to molest her. There's a reference to Choli se Ambe, that is, Choli is the reference to the Indian blouse, as well as to the village of Gaurya and Nindira. And they try to ask, what are those mangoes in the blouse, which could also mean the mangoes from the Choli village. So Gaurya is extremely disturbed by these incidents till one day he sees his mother replying very cleverly to her customers that, yes, but the Choli is of your mother, and you can go home and take by them and take care that they are firm in nature. So this is the way that that Dalit women's short fiction is trying to portray how the Dalit woman is also capable of giving back as good she gets and turning the tables. We have the very famous Bama and her not so very well known story of Ponnutai. Bama's Karukku is usually more in discussion. And we have Tamil writer Bama's story of Ponnutai, who occupies center stage. And she's a phenomenal woman, quote unquote. I'm quoting Maya Angelou. And she's a robust and resplendent image of confident Dalit womanhood. She gets tired of her indolent husband after many years of marriage and children. Notice the trope of motherhood, how it is being portrayed differently here. And she comes back to her parental home. When her husband comes for her and beats her black and blue, she gets her husband arrested. When Mukkandi decides to leave her with her children, her determination and revolutionary stance leaves the readers open-mouthed with shock, awe, and admiration. In a swift move of turning tables, she declares, "They are your children." Quote, "They are your children. You take care of them. I want neither you nor the children I got from you. Is there a law that only the mother should look after the children?" Unquote. Leading to much dark comedy as she cuts open her gold tali or Mangal Sutra from her neck, sells it, and buys stocks for the little shop she opens at the end of the story. So there is the Gujarati short story that I was reading called Queen of Black by Jasumati Parmar. Now, in this Gujarati short story, and I'm trying to introduce a regional perspective of motherhood in the beginning. In the Gujarati short story by Jasumati Parmar, however, we see that she is an extremely caring mother who sometimes doesn't even have enough to give to eat to her children. She encourages them to go for midday meals in the school. But the way the relationship is romantically portrayed between the good for nothing but decent husband of the lady who never beats her up, as she herself admits, but she is unable to give up her romantic aspirations for a middle class life, and the relation between husband and wife is also portrayed romantically, so much so that at the end, when she is almost to be sexually exploited by the friend of her husband, she runs away with her children. That is how she saves her children and herself from ignominy. So in these three different stories, we see how the Dalit mother is represented in three different ways. There is defiance, there is wit, there is assertion. At the same time, there is also a certain surrender sometimes, perhaps, to the ideal of the middle class mother and the middle class wife. Partha Chatterjee is a binary of home and the world, was especially several times applied not only to women but also to Dalit women. And what he contended was that the changes in women's life outside would take place outside the political arena because they take place in the home. The women stay at home. And he ignores the Dalit women's participation as breadwinners and also in major political movements. Kalyani Thakur Chadal has one of the prominent Bengali Dalit writers of Bengal. She has described her experiences as a breadwinner, as an office goer, and she says how she was relegated to a small table in the corner of her office. And one day she is asked in the very early days of her office, she's asked by one of the members of the staff, "From what caste are you?" And she stands up to him and she says, "I am a charal." And he looks down and he moves away after a while. So she says, "I have faced numerous discriminations as an office goer, as an office worker." And so Dalit women have been playing major roles as breadwinners and in political movements. The Urmila Pawar story, vaguely, the odd one, if we study it, we see the protagonist Nalini, who is willing to leave her family. She takes up government quarters, she takes up a job, she takes up government quarters, and she leaves at the end when her husband succumbs to the demands of his mother and is not able to move out of their family accommodation. She just picks up her child and leaves. The Dalit woman just leaves without waiting to know the opinion of her husband, because she knows that he has already succumbed to his mother. So if you study Urmila Pawar's autobiography, however, you will see that these same characters suffer a different fate in her autobiography in real life. But how Urmila Pawar decodes or rather describes these women in her short stories is very different. She makes them, she gives them agency, she gives them power, she gives them the means to change how they react to the circumstances around them. Coming to Gujarati Dalit short stories. Now, Dalit women's short fiction or Dalit women's literature has often been said to revolve around the three forces of caste, class, and gender. And I would love to add the fourth factor here, which is religion. So just as Telugu author Mansa Yenluri says, caste is present in every corner of this nation. And it is not just caste, but caste in the form of a social hierarchy. But religion also creates separate castes. For example, Dalit women also involve Christian women, Muslim women. But these sort of minor categories within Dalit women's society, they are ignored even more by Dalit men and also by the feminist movement. So this four-cornered factors of caste, class, gender, and religion, some of it we see playing out in Gujarati Dalit short stories as well. So you have writers like Chandraben Srimali, you have writers like her stories like Dadro, which means the staircase, and Dunk, which means which talks about food. I have Basumati Parmar also has written a potent short story here, which is, yes, I quoted her before in Queen of Black. So she is also a Gujarati short story writer. Now, Chandraben Srimali in Dadro, she shows how the woman who has conceived a child, she falls down the staircase and is forced to lose the child. And this is something that she portrays from an urban background. And again, in Dunk, she portrays these not just women's truth, but she portrays a general truth about Harijan society, how the Gandhian members who go to a Harijan ashram refuse to partake of food there. Though they are working with the Harijans, they are still conscious of caste. So it is not that Chandraben Srimali is only highlighting the experience of women. She's getting out of her inner experience, and she's also trying to depict the outer world and outer experiences in her short stories. In a similar role, I am reminded of is played by the staircase in Hasyada, Dr. Hasyada Pandya's story, Termite Proof. Now, why I find this story very important is because of the metaphor it uses of the termite. It goes against the Rita Kothari's assertion. Rita Kothari, as some of you who are in the world of translation are very familiar with, she's an important figure in translation writing in Indian literature, Rita Kothari asserts that the Gujarati short story rarely portrays the urban middle class. But in Hasida Pandya's story, we not only have this urban middle class being portrayed, but here she is also in Termite Proof, in the story called Termite Proof in the English translation. She's also turning back tables, and she's portraying here a Brahmin family, an upper caste educated family. And here she is, she's recounting how this upper caste, in this educated upper class Hindu family also, the women are going through the same kind of subjugation, and the staircase becomes a symbol. Since the staircase, I'm reading from the story, since the staircase is an old wooden one and worn slippery smooth from constant use, we have to be very careful while climbing up and down the stairs. As when the terrace slab is being cast and laborers stand equal distance, we position ourselves on the staircase to pass buckets, tubs, pots, and other vessels from one to the other on the way up. So they are filling up water, and they are all positioned on the staircase in this urban middle class family which struggles for water. And the termite, of course, becomes a metaphor for the forces which are eating up the women's existence. My grandmother, I'm quoting from the story, my grandmother, my mother, my kaki, my foi, that is father's sister, my bhabhi, have all become termites. I too am deaf and dumb. The termites are now advancing towards me. Each and every morning of all of us is monitored by traditional codes and rituals. So even in the Hindu upper caste family, these persecutions of women continue, their silent dumbing down, their oppression continues. The mother is unable to take up a job, and these termites are eating up all of Hindu society, is how Dr. Hasida Pandya is writing as a Dalit woman's writer. So she is creating a common platform for both Dalit and non-Dalit women in her story. So when we analyze Gujarati Dalit women's fiction, we see that there are many absences. For example, there are many castes in Gujarati Dalit society, but only the Vankar and the Garoda castes are mainly represented by the women. Chandraben Shrimaliji is from the Garoda caste, and Basumati Parmar is from the Vankar caste. And when they are describing their experiences, they are describing their experiences in their short fiction from a pre-Christian Hindu past. So the Christian past, the Dalit Christians present, does not get reflected in the Gujarati Dalit women's story, unlike in stories of Bama or some other writers. So issues of sexuality and sexual politics, the collective and public threat of rape, sexual assault, exploitation, these are also very much present in the Dalit women's narratives. And I would like to read an extract from Kannada writer B.T. Janhavi's story, Adultery. In Adultery, the adulteress Lilakka is vilified by the entire colony as she has a regular secret visitor. The narrator's elder sister Savita is at the forefront of these gossip mongers. Even after getting away and getting married and moving away, the narrator and her sister share regular reports about the rake's progress. Years after marriage, the once garrulous Savita turns up at her parents' home, pale, gaunt, and dull. The narrator is shocked when Savita calls Lilakka great and supports her choice of adultery. She justifies Lilakka's bold choice as her husband was always away. As a final twist of the skewer, Savita says that even if Lilakka had stayed confined within social norms, her thoughts would have strayed and she would have been an adulteress in mind, just like Savita herself. So B.T. Janhavi, in this acute psychological study, she peels away layers of herself and Savita's mind to reveal her romantic and sexual frustrations. Finally, Savita is shown to identify Lilakka's paramour with her own dream lover. Thus, Janhavi reveals the sexual desires and frustrations latent within a seemingly traditional and devoted housewife. And this is again a sexual revolution by the Dalit short story writer. Elizabeth Abel had said remarked about the theme of androgyny, and she says that women writers, while speaking about African American fiction, she says women writers draw characters with more male and female characteristics. Because women are more confident about their gender identity, in most of their characters there is a combination of male and female roles. So whatever complexity arises in their short story arises from this confusion of what social roles women are supposed to perform, and therefore there is this anti-romantic treatment of heterosexuality in Dalit women's short fiction. But infidelity or loss of partner are never a problem in Dalit women's short fiction, because it would only leave the woman freer and to pursue her own goals. Very briefly, I would like to talk. Do I have time, sir? 5 minutes? Do I have time,
Sure,
sir?
for sure.
Sure. Thank
5
you.
minutes we can have.
Yes, sir. Thank you. So very briefly, I would like, since this is an overview of Dalit women's short fiction, I would like to talk about Bengali short fiction just a little. And we have this in Kalyani Thakur Charal again has written about the political importance of Dalit women, when she says that if all the Dalit women and Dalit women and OBC women are given representation in the parliament, they would gain majority in the parliament, and the upper caste feminists would not be able to hijack the women's bills like usual. So, so this is why women's bills face so much opposition in a sense. So she is very much aware of this politics. And is there a reflection of this agency in Bangla Dalit short stories? We have several writers in Bangla Dalit women writing short fiction like Manju Bala, Sanju Shikdar, we have Mithu Adhikari, Shaptadipa Adhikari. We have again Manjubala, yes, I have already mentioned. And I would just like to mention a few stories like Heart Attack of Manjubala, where there is this Manik, who the protagonist is a male who is disliked by his master, and his mother is dismissed as the maidservant because this child comes first in engineering, while the master's child is failing every year in the engineering. So it's a very it's a very simple narrative structure. In Shutapa by Shonju Shikdar and Uttarun by Mithu Adhikari, education is a key element. In fact, Chuni Kotal's case is brought up again and again to memory, and more than political involvement, education is seen to be the savior of Dalit women in both these stories, that children must get educated, they must rise, they must become doctors or engineers or at the most academicians to gain a toehold in society. We have Dui Prithivi by Shaptadipa Adhikari, and I love this story because it is one story where I saw the metaphor of Dalit language being used. She has made the urban-rural divide has been made clear in Dui Prithivi, and the woman finally rejects her parents and comes back to live with her mother, and look at the agency of the mother who makes her child get well and walk again when she has been abandoned by her husband and children. And the Ojha says, নিমের রস একদিনের জন্যও বন্ধ করা চলবি না কো, তেবে কাল গজকরণী করাতে হবে। এবার মা আকাশ পাতাল হাতড়ায়, গজকরণী সেটা কেমনে পাবো, কিদ্দে রাঁধবো? How will I prepare these medicines? What will I have to do? How to make my daughter well? And I love this dialect being used, this experiment with different voices, different languages being used as metaphor. I would like to end with talking about Digish Mehta, who says that Dalit women's short fiction especially is trying to break out of the literary molds that upper class society expects of them. So how do they break out of this literary mold? By using different metaphors, by breaking out of patriarchal structure, by rejecting the husband, by rejecting the family. And this is being portrayed more and more, though in certain segments of regional representation, we see that Dalit women are still struggling to get a job or education, and that is the focus of Dalit women's short fiction in some of these regional representations. So I would just like to end with the question, with a question perhaps to be thought about, that instead of Dalit or feminist or marginal or religious identities or voices, can we proceed to decoding this fiction, short fiction, as something universal, something pan-Indian, which is beyond the regional and marginal straitjackets that we put into, as an expression maybe of Indian heterogeneity, instead of straitjacketing it into several categories and expressing a more pan-Indian ethos and identity. Thank you so much for listening to me so patiently. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mandakini, for that paper. And finally, suggesting to bar all such categories like Dalit and all, making it universal. Thanks a lot. It was quite thoughtful. Thank you. I now invite Sri Rajat Chaudharyji, who is a bilingual author, translator, critic, and columnist. His most recent novel, The Butterfly Effect, has been twice listed by the Book Riot community, USA, as a 50 must-read eco-disasters in fiction, and in 10 works of environmental literature from around the world. He edited The Best Asian Speculative Fiction and co-edited Multi-Species Cities, a collection of solar punk stories from Asia Pacific. Chaudharyji is a recipient of Charles Wallace Creative Writing Fellowship, Hawthornden Castle Fellowship, among others, and his short fiction has been featured in the climate change education video game Survive the Century. Rajatji, hearty welcome.
Thank you. I was listening rapt to all these presentations that preceded me. Mine is kind of more of a manifesto. And what happens when you're doing these programs on Zoom, as soon as you switch on as soon as you open your Word document, all the listeners vanish from your screen, and you feel that you don't have an audience. But I know you are all there. I have titled, I have a paper actually, it's about, it will take about 12 to 14 minutes to read. And it's titled Indian Short Fiction from Firelit Fables to Fighting the Fire. So first, let me begin by thanking Sahitya Akademi and the English Advisory Board and its chair, Professor Dasgupta, for inviting me. This is a very important symposium that they have organized. And I will go directly into my paper, which begins with a kind of a roundup of the history, a very brief roundup of the history of the short story in this country. And then I gradually move on to what could sound like a manifesto to some. So here we go. We are all part of stories big and small, exciting or dragging, life-changing or momentarily significant, with a Chekhovian afterglow or a necklace-like twist reminiscent of Maupassant. Life is driven by conflict, more so because of existential challenges of the present. And as listeners or protagonists, we grow up and get together around stories. We live stories all our lives, and our final ejection from the system to be turned to insect feed or smoky vapor, and in some cases, trees too, are often story-like in their dark comedy or solemn climax. And for millions of us here in this endless land of a myriad destinies, driven and determined by powers often beyond our control or born out of our own device, tales are literally endless. Powers that we have unlocked, reserves of energy deep under the earth that we have mastered to drive our carbonophilic dreams. How do these propel the stories we are and we should be telling today. As a writer of stories long and short, and also one writing about stories as a reviewer, I am inclined to move beyond a general report about the Indian short story, if such an exotic creature does indeed exist, onto an inquiry about where it could or even should be headed. Now, you know, doing that is very risky. You get brickbats if you push a certain agenda. Well, so the remainder of my presentation will be in three parts. First, I will briefly address the origins of the short story in India, sketching a line from there to the present. I will then move on to the substantive section, where I will try to draw attention to a particular kind of literature of engagement that is indispensable in our times. And finally, finish with my own experience of reading and editing these new works, this new kind of writing. So let us first briefly visit the past to see where from stories arrived. As we all know, the short story in India is a child of the great storytelling traditions of earlier generations, where on cold winter evenings or after harvest, people gathered around a fire in the village and traveling storytellers told them fables about animals, tales of gods and goddesses, kings and queens, thieves and lovers. Our chairperson has already discussed this. The Kawar Bachan of Rajasthan were beautifully decorated wooden structures used for storytelling about gods, or the Potachitras of Bengal, where stories about religious, secular, and contemporary themes are expressed through stunningly painted images, accompanied by singing, are two of the many bearers of this ancient tradition of story as entertainment, or story as something that keeps the audience engaged. Keeping the audience engaged is one of the touchstones of good fiction. We all know that. And our earliest storytellers were adepts in this art, as are some of our contemporaries. Rushdie, whose Harun and the Sea of Stories draws on one of the foundational collections of stories from India, the Kathasarit Sagara, says, "A good story is one that makes you listen. The art of telling a story is keeping an audience sitting there and from throwing things at you." Apart from our wandering storytellers, the stories in books like the Kathasarit Sagar, the 11th century compilation from Kashmir, or the tales from the Panchatantra, all excel in this task of keeping the reader glued to the page or the audience to the performance. It is indeed interesting to note in passing how these early stories from India are echoed in the greatest collections of stories from the world, the 1001 Nights or Aesop's Fables, pointing to a rich to and fro movement of tales on the lips of traders, soldiers, and others. From these earliest beginnings, the short story in India has evolved and matured on the branches of its linguistic diversity and literary cultures, giving us a well-laden tree of literary gems akin to the divine tree of wish fulfillment, the Kalpavriksha or whatever. So drawing on, arguing, critiquing, and developing this tradition, the modern times saw a flowering of the short story. This development was influenced by literary winds from the West, as we all know, as masters like Poe, Chekhov, Maupassant, Hemingway, Carver worked this form, while it was also fashioned and refashioned by the experiences of colonialism and that of a post-colonial developing nation, with all its bitter winds, specific concerns, and strange tides. It is not my intention to turn this talk into a listing and discussion of the specialities of practitioners of shorter fiction in Indian languages. So I will steer clear of names from Mulk Raj Anand to O.V. Vijayan or Rabindranath Thakur to Jhumpa Lahiri, as I am not in the business of producing an encyclopedia or a compendium of Indian short fiction. I will instead return to the point that I alluded to earlier, one which addresses the need to tell stories, Indian stories, that reflect the unprecedented and unimagined aspects of our times. Many of you are familiar of the chasm that opened between nature and science on one hand and culture on the other in the early hours of modernity, which in the literary sphere has resulted in the relegation of certain kinds of stories to the outhouses of genre. C.P. Snow lamented about this divide between the science and the arts. Bruno Latour engaged with the partitioning project of modernity, and Amitav Ghosh explained how hybrid texts like science fiction which draw from both the wells of science and human experience or culture, tend to be neglected by the mainstream literary establishment. This has been going on for long, but in the last few decades, a new and powerful critic has appeared on the scene, whose influence has served a body blow to this artificial boundary, as it attacked literature and literary culture's failure to address one of the biggest existential crises of our times. We all know what it is: climate change. Of course, we are talking about climate change and ecological collapse. The lengthening shadow of anthropogenic climate change on culture and its real impact on lives has re-emphasized the importance of telling stories which help readers imagine the climate crisis in its varied manifestations and impacts, where human experience is inextricably entwined with science and the life of other beings. Indian literature, and in fact the short story, is also beginning to address these changes, and new writing which is conscious of this crisis has been emerging, but we need more. As we have already seen in the first two presentations, stories and poetry of nature as sacred, valued, or exalted are to be found in all cultures, from ancient times, right through movements like Romanticism and up to the present. However, there's a difference here. However, the awareness of the devastation that we have brought upon ourselves and the planet demands a new literature which brings its own rewards and challenges. The necessity and characteristics of this new writing, be it short or long fiction, movie or a video game, which beyond entertainment helps us imagine and engage with the future, have been variously addressed by people like researchers like Gregor Sanderson in his work on imaginaries, in texts like Nick Admerson's 6 Proposals for the Reform of Literature in the Age of Climate Change, Timothy Clark's work on timescales, and others. Among them, Admerson's proposal calls for an emphasis on connectedness, doing away with progress-based narratives and stories centered on the lone hero, while others like Amitav Ghosh have focused on the environmental uncanny, the presence of the non-human in such stories. Non-human here doesn't only mean ghosts, it could be nature also. Studies by Matthew Schneider Meyerson and others run on readers of this new climate writing have found that these stories not only help people better imagine the changing world, but also nudge some of them towards deeper levels of belief, awareness, and attitudinal change. These same studies also found that character identification and transportation into the story, which are well-known markers of any good fiction, often have an impact on how they affect readers. So there's no difference there with classical, any literary fiction. Still, we do not come across many climate stories or the ones broadly identifiable as Anthropocene fiction being written in this country. It's changing, of course. As writers and critics of a post-colonial society, it is necessary for us to look at the divergence between post-colonial writing and nature writing of the sort more common in the West to understand why this might be so. The post-colonial lens and experience of power and exploitation does make our stories about the environment different. Rob Nixon, the critic, has shown how place, displacement, timelessness, lost time, and other concepts and categories divide post-colonial and eco-critical approaches to fiction. However, this is how it's changing. However, with the concept of climate justice weaving its way into a new breed of climate fiction in books like Gun Island or The Wind-Up Girl, both are novels, we find a coming together of these divergent streams. Over the last few years, I have had the opportunity to be in an editorial role in 2 fiction anthologies in English, one centered around what if or speculative fiction from Asia, and the other about solar punk and multi-species tales from Asia Pacific. In working on both, and also while researching my own eco-fiction novel, The Butterfly Effect, I have discovered the work of Indian writers of short fiction who have been negotiating the unprecedented changes of the Anthropocene, and especially that of climate change. There are many writers writing these stories now. Through these readings, I have been introduced to the short fiction of Priya Sarukkai Chabria in stories like Listen and Slow Glow, Shweta Taneja in stories like The Songs That Humanity Lost Reluctantly to Dolphins, or The Daughter That Bleeds, which was nominated for a major French prize. Rimi B. Chatterjee, well-known name, Arfabad, Lopa Ghosh's Crow, and others, which, through the use of a variety of devices, techniques, and genre tropes, which include satire, humor, poetry, fantasy, sci-fi, and more, evince a sharp awareness about the Anthropocene in its myriad manifestations and politics. Some of these new stories, like Things That Bend But Don't Break by S.B. Divya, a scientist writer, about innovation and choice in a solar-powered future, are among the most hopeful, while those like Crow by Lopa Ghosh incisively imagines a climate-ravaged post-capitalist wasteland. Elsewhere, noted science fiction writer Vandana Singh, in her short fiction in stories like Requiem or With Fate Conspire, brilliantly engages the politics of stories and narratives in a climate-changed world, while new authors like Kanishk Tharoor, in his story A United Nations in Space, exhibits a gentle mastery of techniques that suit the literature of the Anthropocene. I am painfully aware that by focusing on English, I am leaving out writers like Mahashweta Devi and Anita Agnihotri in Bengali, Gopinath Mohanty in Odia, and several others who have engaged with elements of Anthropocene fiction in their own work. There are a host of reasons which make the storyfying of climate futures, especially hopeful ones, notoriously difficult, not the least among which is the tension between aesthetics and politics. Many of our authors working in this field excel in balancing these tensions, presenting us with engaging tales of a troubled time and its possible futures. Between fighting the wildfires of climate change and drawing memorable and engaging portraits of this through their stories, Indian writers are increasingly responding to the creative challenges of the Anthropocene. It would only be appropriate if an apex organization like the Sahitya Akademi, acknowledging the importance of telling these tales, champions their cause by encouraging more writers from different Indian languages to write, translate, share, publish, and popularize these works. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Rajat. In fact, we are all eager to hear again the concluding remarks of the chair, but unfortunately, Professor Nayak has been facing some network issues because of which he couldn't join in again. But thankfully, he spoke initially at length, briefly though, and elaborated upon several traditions of Indian short fiction. So together, we will thank him first, finally, for so brilliantly opening this symposium. And thanks to Rajat Chaudhary ji again, Mandakini ji, Professor Dr. Mala Panduranga ji, Sri Joshi Joseph ji, and Dr. Joseph Kohipalli ji. It was a wonderful symposium, and thanks for sharing your brilliant insights into perceiving short fiction. Thanks a lot, and thanks for being with Sahitya Akademi. Together, all of us, again, let us thank all the connoisseurs who watched us and shared their comment on YouTube Live. Thanks all. Thanks for being with Sahitya Akademi. Namaskar.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.